these people?
So, if anyone doesn't know, Julian Assange is probably about to be extradited here. Um, so
Being
this
more
is,
likely at this point.
yeah, the article by Chris Hedges, The Imminent Extradition of Julian Assange and the Death of Journalism. So I felt like this was a great article that summarizes a lot in a succinct manner. And for once, Chris Hedges didn't write an entire dissertation. So I figured that that was also useful. Washington, D.C. He also posted this to SheerPost. High Court Judge Jonathan Swift, who previously worked for a variety of British government agencies as a barrister, and said his favorite clients are, quote, security and intelligence agencies, rejected two applications by Julian Assange's lawyers to appeal his extradition last week. The extradition order was signed last June by Home Secretary Priti Patel. Julian's legal team have filed a final application for appeal, the last option available in the British courts. If accepted, the case could proceed to a public hearing in front of two new High Court judges. If rejected, Julian could be immediately extradited to the United States, where he will stand trial for 18 counts of violating the Espionage Act, charges that could see him receive a 175-year sentence as early as this week. Excuse me. The only chance to block an extradition is the final appeal is rejected, as I expect it will be, says Chris Hedges, would come from the European Court of Human Rights, the parliamentary arm of the Council of Europe, which created the ECTHR, that's that Human Rights Council. Their commissioner for human rights opposed Julian's detention, extradition, and prosecution because it represents a dangerous precedent for journalists. It is unclear if the British government would abide by the court's decision, even though it is obligated to do so. If it ruled against extradition, or if the UK would extradite Julian before an appeal to the European Court can be heard, Julian, once shipped to the US, would be put on trial in the US District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia, where most espionage cases have been won by the US government. Judge Vanessa Barrister at Westminster Magistrate Court refused to authorize the US government's extradition request in January because of the severity of the conditions Julian would endure in the US prison system. That was in 21. Faced with the conditions of near total isolation without the protective factors which limited his risk at Her Majesty's Prison Belmarsh, I am satisfied the procedures described by the U.S. will not prevent Mr. Assange from finding a way to commit suicide, said Barrister when handing down her 132-page ruling. And for this reason, I have decided extradition would be oppressive by reason of mental harm, and I order his discharge. Barrister's decision was overturned after an appeal by U.S. authorities. The High Court accepted the conclusions of the lower court about increased risk of suicide and inhumane prison conditions, but it also accepted four assurances in U.S. diplomatic note number 74, given to the court in February 21, which promised Julian would be well treated. They promised, Collin. The U.S. government claimed that its assurances entirely answers the concerns which caused the judge in the lower court to discharge Mr. Assange. The assurances state that Julian will not be subject to special administrative measures, aka SAMs. They promote that Julian, an Australian citizen, can serve his sentence in Australia if the Australian government requests his extradition. Where they at, Collin? They promise he will receive adequate clinical and psychological care. They promote that pre-trial and post-trial Julian will not be held in the administrative maximum facility in Florence, Colorado. No one is held pre-trial in ADX Florence, but it sounds reassuring. ADX Florence is not the only supermax prison in the U.S. Julian could be placed in one of the other Guantanamo-like facilities in a communications management unit. CMUs are highly restricted units that replace the near isolation imposed by SAMs. None of these assurances are worth the paper they are written on. All come with escape clauses. None are legally binding. Should Julian do something subsequent to the offering of these assurances that meets the test for the imposition of SAMs or designation to ADX, he will, the court conceded, be subject to those harsher forms of control. If Australia does not request a transfer, it cannot be a cause for criticism of the USA. or a reason for regarding the assurances as inadequate to meet the judge's concerns. The ruling read, and even if that were not the case, it would take Julian 10 to 15 years to appeal his sentence up to the U.S. Supreme Court, which would be more than enough time to destroy him psychologically and physically. This is a guy who's already had a stroke, correct?
Correct.
The extradition of Julian will be the next step in the slow motion execution of the publisher and founder of WikiLeaks and one of the most important journalists of our generation. It will ensure that Julian spends the rest of his life in a U.S. prison. It will create legal precedents that will criminalize any investigation into the inner workings of power, even by citizens from another country. It will be a body blow to our anemic democracy, which is rapidly metamorphosing into corporate totalitarianism. Totalitarianism? There we go. I am stunned by this full frontal assault on journalism, as I am by the lack of public outrage, especially by the media. The very belated call from the New York Times, The Guardian, Le Monde, Der Spiegel, and El País, all of whom published material provided by WikiLeaks. To drop the extradition charges is too little, too late. All of the public protests I have attended in defense of Julian in the U.S. are sparsely attended. Our passivity makes us complicit in our own enslavement. Julian's case from the start has been a judicial farce. Former Ecuadorian President Lenin Moreno terminated Julian's rights of asylum as a political refugee in violation of international law. He then authorized London Metropolitan Police to enter the Ecuadorian embassy, diplomatically sanctioned sovereign territory, to arrest a naturalized citizen of Ecuador. Moreno's government, which revoked Julian's citizenship, was granted a large loan by the International Monetary Fund for its assistance. Donald Trump, by demanding Julian's extradition under the Espionage Act, criminalized journalism in much the same way Woodrow Wilson did when he shut down socialist publications such as The Masses. The hearings, some of which I attended in London and others of which I sat through online, mocked basic legal protocols. They included the decision to ignore the CIA's surveillance and recording of meetings between Julian and his attorneys during his time as a political refugee in the embassy, eviscerating attorney-client privilege. This alone should have seen the case thrown out of court. They included validating the decision to charge Julian, although he is not a U.S. citizen, under the Espionage Act. They included Kafkaesque contortions to convince the courts that Julian is not a journalist. They ignored Article 4 of the UK-US extradition treaty that prohibits extradition for political offenses. I watched as the prosecutor, James Lewis, representing the U.S., gave legal directives to Judge Barrister Baratzer, who promptly adopted them as her legal decision. The judicial lynching of Julian has far more in common with the dark days of Lubyanka than the ideals of British jurisprudence. The debate over arcane legal nuances distracts us from the fact that Julian has not committed a crime in Britain, other than an odd charge of breaching bail conditions when he sought asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy. Normally, this would entail a fine. He was instead sentenced to a year in Belmarsh prison and has been held there since April 2019. The decision to seek Julian's extradition, contemplated by Barack Obama's administration, was pursued by the Trump administration following WikiLeaks' publication of the documents known as Vault 7, which exposed the CIA's cyber warfare programs designed to monitor and take control of cars, smart TVs, web browsers, and the operating systems of most smartphones, as well as Microsoft Windows, Mac OS, and Linux. Julian, as I noted in a column filed from London last year, is targeted because of the Iraq war logs released in October 2010, which documented numerous U.S. war crimes, including images seen in the collateral murder video of the gunning down of 2 Reuters journalists and 10 other civilians and severely injuring 2 children. He is targeted because he made public the killing of nearly 700 civilians who had approached too closely to U.S. convoys and checkpoints, including pregnant women, the blind and deaf, and at least 30 children. He is targeted because he exposed more than 15,000 unreported deaths of Iraqi civilians and the torture and abuse of some 800 men and boys aged between 14 to 89 in Guantanamo Bay detention camp. He is targeted because he showed us that Hillary Clinton in 2009 ordered U.S. diplomats to spy on UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and other UN representatives from China, France, Russia, and the UK, spying that included obtaining DNA, iris scans, fingerprints, and personal passwords, all part of the long pattern of illegal surveillance that included eavesdropping on UN Secretary General Kofi Annan in the weeks before the US-led invasion of Iraq in 2003. He is targeted because he exposed that Obama, Hillary Clinton, and the CIA backed the June 2009 military coup in Honduras and overthrew the democratically elected president Manuel Zelaya, replacing him with a murderous and corrupt military regime. Par for the course for us. He's targeted because he released documents that revealed the United States secretly launched missile, bomb, and drone attacks on Yemen, killing scores of civilians. He's targeted because he made public the off-the-record talks Hillary Clinton gave to Goldman Sachs, talks for which she was paid $657,000, a sum so large it can only be considered a bribe, as well as her private assurances to Wall Street that she would do their bidding while promising the public financial regulation and reform. For revealing those truths alone, he is guilty. The U.S. court system is even more draconian than the British court system. It can use SAM's anti-terrorism laws and the Espionage Act to block Julian from speaking to the public, being released on bail, or seeing the secret evidence used to convict him. The CIA was created to carry out assassinations, coups, torture, kidnapping, blackmail, character assassinations, and illegal spying. It has targeted U.S. citizens in violation of its charter. These activities were exposed in 1975 by the Church Committee hearings in the Senate and the Pike Committee hearings in the House. Working with UC Global, the Spanish security firm, and the embassy, the CIA put Julian under 24-hour video and digital surveillance. It discussed kidnapping and assassinating him while he was in the embassy, which included plans of a shootout on the streets with involvement by London Metro Police. The U.S. allocates a secret black budget of $52 billion a year to hide multiple types of clandestine projects carried out by the National Security Agency, the CIA, and other intelligence agencies, usually beyond the scrutiny of Congress. All these clandestine activities, especially after the attacks of 9/11, have massively expanded. Senator Frank Church, after examining the heavily redacted CIA documents released to his committee, defined the CIA's covert activity as a semantic disguise for murder, coercion, blackmail, bribery, and the spreading of lies. The CIA and intelligence agencies, along with the military, all of which operate without effective congressional oversight, are the engines behind Julian's extradition. Julian inflicted, by exposing their crimes and lies, a grievous wound. They demand vengeance. The control these forces seek abroad is the control they seek at home. Julian may soon be imprisoned for life in the U.S. for journalism, but he won't be the only one. Thoughts, Care Bear?
This is hard.
Yep.
Hard in the sense that we knew this was going to happen. I mean, we've talked about Assange enough on this show, but I think for me, I mean, I always started hearing about Assange when Richard Medhurst started talking about him in 2020. And now, almost 3 years later, you know, he's more likely going to be extradited. And, you know, Chris Hedges is right. Like, there has not been enough outrage over this. And shout out to Misty. You know, she is like our Assange guru, and she leads Assange rallies in DC often. The last one that I went to in, I think it was in October this past year, was probably the best that was attended. I would say there was about over 200 people there this time. But I've been to Assange rallies in DC that she has hosted that there were only maybe about 50, if not less.
Yeah.
So it's just not surprising, but it is surprising of how much little discussion has had mainstream media, we know it's not going to be. But I think even in independent media,
Yeah.
like people don't talk about Assange enough, and especially being in this space, it should be talked about more because we're essentially doing. I wouldn't call myself a journalist, but we are reporting, or at least commenting on the news, and
Well,
essentially the censorship that we're seeing on YouTube,
is an
and
extension of this. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So
So speaking of Medhurst, he's hosting this. I don't know if he's hosting, but he's being
I
a
think
part
he's
of.
posting it. But I think he just tweeted this out.
Yeah. Parliament Square, London, 1 p.m. Saturday, 24th of June. If you know anyone in the UK area, especially London, please tell them to show up for this. Even if they're not
Hmm.
supporters of Julian, I think it'd be a good idea for them to show up, see what's happening.
If you
So,
care about free press, if you care about censorship, you should, which should be everybody.
yeah,
If you're in London, you should participate.
yeah, I
Um,
agree.
but
So, but yeah, that's
it's
it for me tonight, pretty much.
yeah. I mean, it's just sad that we knew this day was coming, but I think the fact that we're pretty much there now, it doesn't make it any better or feels any worse. I would argue that a non-U.S. citizen is going to get extradited here and essentially has been slowly tortured to death
Yeah,
in terms of doing his job,
yeah,
which
it's depressing for sure. Um, so, and it's probably going to be some military tribunal that we can't have access to or see what's happening.
right.
And he'll be locked away and the key will be thrown down a well. Um,
And
you
then
know,
like the idea of putting him in a max prison, like why? What kind of risk is what kind of risk is he going to try and commit?
people that they
Like,
openly plotted the assassination of. Like, we're going to give them the right to incarcerate at, like, especially with after what happened with Epstein. I don't think they should be allowed to touch it. So, you know, uh um so yeah, I mean, hopefully, boat crashes or helicopter gets lost or something, anything. Um,
but yeah, I
but
think we definitely should watch it, especially if this becomes breaking news
yeah,
later in the
we'll
week.
we'll be there for it. So,
Yeah, and I'll be free by then, so I'll be able to report quickly
okay,
um if this is a breaking story by week's end or early next week. But yeah, but
okay.
it's
Well,
so